I'm really glad to be here to tell you more about the work that Trase does, mapping deforestation in supply chains. And I'm going to start by talking about why this is needed. We're here today talking on the theme of the climate crisis. And essentially, there is no solution to the climate crisis that doesn't also involve a solution to the problem of deforestation. The IPCC estimates that about 11% of global emissions are due to deforestation and land use change. And one key driver of deforestation is agricultural conversion for key commodities. Put simply, forests are cleared so that cattle can graze and they are later processed into beef or leather. Forests are cleared so that soy can be grown, palm oil, coffee, cocoa, various other commodities. And some of these commodities are consumed domestically in the countries where they are produced, but a substantial proportion is also traded internationally, and that contributes to global emissions. So the context that Trase works in, we attempt to address the question of how to share responsibility for these impacts across supply chains that are global and complex. So this is the point where I guess I should also explain what is Trase. Trase is a program and a partnership. We are not a not-for-profit initiative. I work for Global Canopy, and the other main founding partner of Trase is the Stockholm Environment Institute. And you can see that there's a kind of global network of partners that we work with in this endeavor. And what Trase does is to bring transparency to supply chains, agricultural supply chains that drive tropical deforestation. We map supply chains in order to connect consumer markets, meaning importing markets, such as perhaps the UK might import tropical commodities, or China, or various other importing markets. We connect these markets to tropical deforestation and other impacts in producer countries. So if the UK imports Brazilian soy, for instance, what is the deforestation associated with that? To do this, we bring together disparate and publicly available data. You can find our data and analysis on our platforms, Trase.earth, Trase Finance, and Trase Insights. We have mapped, as of 2021, over 60% of the global trade in forest risk commodities, by which we mean tropical forests, because obviously there are also other forests, but our focus is on tropical forests. And you can see a selection of the particular commodities and the areas of production that we have mapped on this slide. So when we say we map them, what we then do is we produce various data products and visualizations that enable us to represent and understand these supply chain flows. So this is a Sankey flow. It's one of our signature data visualizations. And what you can see is that if you look at, for instance, let's say the production of soy in a country like Brazil in a given year, what we can do is trace the production and the deforestation impact of that production in specific regions of production. We associate that with companies and traders who export various volumes of production. And we associate that with various countries of destination and importing markets. And that enables us to say that there are certain volumes of imports that are associated with certain quantities of deforestation exposure in particular regions of production. And what this does is it enables, let's say, companies who are looking at their supply chains, or financial institutions who are concerned about their portfolios, or governments who want to do something about their imported deforestation, to act in a more strategic and targeted way. So I'll give you an example here. Let's say you were looking at a specific commodity in a specific country, and then a specific importing market, let's say China, importing soy from Brazil. You can actually identify the specific areas where sourcing is likely to be concentrated, also where deforestation is concentrated, and also you can often, in the case of very many commodities and countries, you can also identify the key companies who are associated with deforestation risks. So this is an opportunity for targeted action. It's not, all soy from Brazil is irretrievably tainted. It's more a case of identifying exactly where those impacts are and who are the actors in that supply chain. How does Trase do this? It would take me far more than 8 minutes, more like 8 hours to explain, but briefly, in a nutshell, There's various data requirements in order to build a supply chain. For every single combination of commodity and country of production, that's going to be different because there are different kinds of production involved and there's different data sources available. But broadly speaking, the per shipment trade information is the backbone of what Trase does, being able to connect specific companies to specific exports from a port in certain volumes and then the importing markets that goes to. We use in-country asset information like tax information or company declarations in order to build a map of where assets are located. So where are the soy silos? Who are they owned by? Where are the slaughterhouses? Where are the palm oil refineries or mills? And that gives us allows us to build a picture and develop a decision tree about who in the supply chain is associated with what volume of production from specific regions of production. And there may be other additional information depending on the specific context that we use. So that allows us to then attribute volumes of commodity flow to specific actors from specific regions. In terms of measuring the deforestation impact, so we use here spatially explicit data, meaning satellite imagery, and we can see where an area of land that was previously forest in subsequent years becomes pasture or becomes soy production. And that enables us to say within this region of production in a given year, there is a total quantity of deforestation exposure, which is spatially explicitly identified. And then that exposure is attributed to various supply chain actors based on their volumes of sourcing as we've allocated via the decision tree. So that is very briefly how it works, but if you want to know more, all of our methods and data sets are set out on our website, so you can find out more there. Trase and governments, what is it that we can do for governments? So the context of this, of course, is that a lot of importing countries are really kind of stepping up their action on addressing imported deforestation in their supply chains. There's been a range of high-profile national commitments, like the Glasgow Leaders Declaration at COP26 last year. And interestingly and unprecedentedly, there is a range of legislative measures that is coming into play. In the UK, the Environment Act has already been passed, but we're still awaiting secondary legislation for the details. There's a European Union proposal, and there's also an incipient piece of legislation in the US. And what these regimes have in common is they are seeking to place obligations on importing actors in these respective jurisdictions to scrutinize their imports and scrutinize their commodity flows in order to ascertain and demonstrate that they are either deforestation-free in some cases or illegal deforestation-free in some other cases. So the regimes are not all identical. And this raises a very interesting question from the point of view of governments about the data disclosure that's actually required from companies in order to meaningfully demonstrate this. What is necessary and what is reasonable to require in terms of data disclosure, and also what is going to be required in terms of authorities in investment, in understanding and scrutinizing the disclosure that's made so that you can actually ascertain that the policy objectives are met. So this is a massive area. We've been doing lots of work with governments to kind of understand ways in which they can track this. I can share more later. But broadly speaking, that's the sort of work that Trase has been doing with governments. So thank you.
Jolene, thank you very much indeed. I'll come to the audience in the room first for the questions this time. Just to remind you, if you are watching us online, please use the Slido. If you're not on the Slido already, it's bit.ly/SlidoDB31. Who in the room would like to ask the first question? We've got one down here.
Thanks, Kate Ogden. How far along supply chains can you track things?
So Trase maps what we would describe as the middle of the supply chain. We go from regions of production, so for instance, a municipality in Brazil or maybe a kabupaten in Indonesia or a certain region of production, through to exporting ports to importing ports. We don't, the Trase data doesn't cover what happens after the importing port stage. So for instance, which companies are using it in the European Union, let's say, or in the UK, that's not on our platform.
Brilliant, thanks. Any more questions in the room? I think we've got, do we have one there? Yeah, and I'll come to you next.
Hi, great talk. This is really interesting. I have, I guess, a sort of tripartite question. So you said 60% of deforestation is mapped, but is that in terms of, or trade is mapped, but is that in terms of dollar units or actual deforestation? And then if it's in terms of deforestation, I guess I was wondering what the challenges are of like the dark matter remaining part of mapping all of it, and then what the kind of uncertainties are associated with the mapping itself.
Okay, so that 60% figure is about the volumes of commodities associated with tropical deforestation. Yeah. So it's not the amount of deforestation, but the commodities. Yeah. As for what's left, I mean, there is a huge amount of work that goes into mapping each, we call them contexts, it's a bit of jargon, that's a marriage of a commodity and a country of production. And so we have concentrated our efforts on those commodity country combinations that are most associated with a total volume of tropical deforestation globally. There are a huge range of possible countries and commodities, but that's where we are at the moment. Yeah.
And we had a question down the front row. It already got answered. Oh, okay. Already got answered. Any more in the room? We've got another one down the front.
Thank you. If I were an exporter and I didn't want to pick up in your data, what would I do about it? I'm going to call that, what would I do to avoid being in your data? And from the government's point of view, what anti-avoidance action and policies can we put into place to ensure that those data flows are mapped? You can probably tell from this question I used to be a taxman.
That's an interesting question. So what would I do if I didn't want to turn up in trace data? That's a really, really good question. And the data sources that we use in different countries of production will vary greatly, because some have much more extensive systems of recording and disclosure and transparency than others. And it's interesting, actually, because we, for instance, work a lot with the Brazilian context, and actually finding out how land is used in Brazil is a lot more straightforward than getting access to, let's say, land registry records in the UK for like who owns what land and how that's used. So I guess central to our data sources is those collections of things like land registries or like tax information that reveals ownership of assets. Actually, we are seeing in some places there's a movement more towards improving the disclosure rather than obscuring it. So for instance, probably as a result partly of global interest in palm oil deforestation, we're finding that a lot of companies involved in palm oil are doing more to reveal the linkages, let's say, between exports and refineries and mills. And as the demand for deforestation-free supply grows, we think there might actually be advantages to being more transparent, because if you can demonstrate that your supply is deforestation-free, that is arguably a marketing advantage in a world that wants that. Those various data sources are key. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question was about avoidance by
what does government do to stop avoidance?
I see. Okay. Are you talking here about the producing country governments or the importing? Okay. So what we think there is a lot of scope for in terms of improving disclosure around this would basically be to have investment in monitoring systems and investment in verification systems. We know that, for instance, in Brazil, there has been an increase in a lot of deforestation in recent years, and there's question marks about the level of funding and support that might be available to things like, let's say, the satellite programs or the various forest monitoring programs. So what's really important is to see governments in producing countries and in importing countries step up in investment into those systems. There's also a lot that can be done by importing countries in terms of standardizing and harmonizing how they understand their imported deforestation exposure, which is part of what we've been doing as well. Actually, we worked with the JNCC to develop an experimental statistic which is, broadly speaking, sort of tries to indicate the UK's imported impact on, imported environmental impact. And we've recently been working with the German Development Agency to also develop different standards for understanding like what deforestation is imported via direct trade or after you take into account re-exports, if you're looking at a consumption footprint as a whole. But many of these things are still in a relatively incipient form. I think a lot more can be done to standardize.
Thanks. We've got another question online, another question from Anonymous. What's your biggest challenge in getting governments to engage beyond commitments?
That's a really good question. So I think it's clear from what I've said about legislation that actually there is now much more concrete action being taken in terms of implementing legislation. One of the challenges is going to be how to operationalize that in a way that has the desired impact. It is untested territory in many ways. There have in the past been other sorts of maybe analogous legislations, let's say timber regulations, attempting to get timber to comply to certain standards with regards to deforestation. But this is a lot broader across very many more commodities and very many different kind of means of production and different sort of data sources will be available. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in investing, I think, in the capacity to understand these different contexts and to ensure that, let's say you're an enforcement agency, you've received in order to comply with due diligence legislation this massive amount of disclosure of all the sourcing plots or other information. How do you actually make sense of that? How do you decide whether this is enough to demonstrate compliance or actually indicates a problem and requires some kind of other enforcement action? That's a really non-trivial problem and one that I think governments will really have to step up on.
Great. If you can answer this final question in 10 seconds. From Jeremy, your slide on deforestation looked like it showed areas of a few hectares change and soy produced of a few hundred tons. Is this an example or is the mapping really as accurate as that?
I mean, I think for these more detailed questions, it's probably best to look at the specific methodological documents that we've got, because that's also going to vary according to country and commodity. But yeah, great question. And it's all written up on the website. So
Brilliant.
Please, trace.earth.
Great presentation and great answers as well. Thank you very much, Jolene.
Thank you.